Welcome back for part 3 of our series on the history of ROTC at IU. So if you've already watched the first two, you went all the way back to 1840 and the beginnings, and then we went up to 1916 in the first one. Then in the second one, we went from 1917 all the way up to 1965, because 1965 was a break year where the ROTC program changed, was no longer mandatory for all freshmen and sophomore men. And that's where we're going to pick up today with part 3 in our series. Along with these changes that happened, one of the other changes that came with the new ROTC program that had been mandated by Congress through the ROTC Revitalization Act was they changed a lot of the curriculum. A lot of the focus really moved to being very leadership development, very personal development, broadly military leadership, rather than focusing on the things specific to a particular kind of unit, like an artillery unit or a medical unit or those sort of things. It was very, the curriculum overhaul was a big piece of the change that came with it. So that drop in enrollment in ROTC was not as severe at IU as it was at a lot of other institutions. So one of the things that you saw at some institutions is they saw 60, 70, 80% drops immediately when ROTC was no longer required. At IU, it was a much more steady decline over a series of years. And so you can see here where they're talking about the 68, 69 year, they were down to 800 students, which was a 1/3 drop from the previous year. So if you kind of back up the numbers here, you can see that yes, there was an immediate drop, and then it kind of slowly rolled out after that. So there were still a large number of folks that were participating in it, but ROTC had become unpopular on campus in the sense that it was the manifestation of the military. This was the height of the Vietnam War protests. People were really disenchanted with the military, the government in general. So you can also see in this article, they talk about the attempted firebombing of the ROTC building here on campus, and peace signs being painted on their vehicles, and some of the other things that happened. I also did a great interview with a alum of that period who later went on to be a general in the military, and he talked about how he actually dropped out of ROTC during this time because of this anti-war sentiment and feeling like maybe this isn't the right thing for me and everything else. He also talked about how just simply walking across campus in uniform, he was spit on, he had rocks thrown at him, those sort of things. And so this really created a lot of hostile environment towards the ROTC program amongst the student body, which we'll come back to here in a second. So that hostility amongst the student body manifested itself through the student government. And the IU student government asked the university to consider removing ROTC from campus. And so they held meetings and talked about whether or not ROTC belonged on campus or should be. Lots of arguments one way or the other about whether or not it should or shouldn't be. They then turned that over to the faculty council, and the faculty council did a whole investigation and a review of the ROTC program to figure out what they should do with it. Now, interestingly enough, there's a weird thing that happens here with our ROTC program that didn't happen elsewhere, but really put our program in a unique perspective. So at this point, and this, for folks that don't understand higher ed organization, this might not make a lot of sense, but so the ROTC program at that point was a academic department in the College of Arts and Sciences. Both Air Force and Army ROTC were in there. But the College of Arts and Sciences didn't want them anymore, and nobody else would take them. And so they became the only academic departments that report directly to the president, now the provost. And so as they literally, when it comes to requesting funding and being a piece of that, they are at the same level as the College of Arts and Sciences, the business school, all these other groups. They report directly to the provost, just like those deans do. So that really put them in a unique place that they weren't part of an academic unit, but at the same time still had the resources and the availability, and they continue in that role through today. It was also during this period of controversy that the Department of Defense started allowing women into ROTC programs. And so they started first with Air Force in the late 60s, and a couple years later, the Army did it in 1970. Now, in the previous episodes, we talked about the roles of women in uniform on campus. In 1970, when the Army decided they were going to pilot the program to allow women to participate, they chose 10 schools around the country that they were going to allow to do this. Well, guess who was one of those 10 pilot schools? Indiana University, because we'd had women in uniform for nearly 50 years at that point. So it wasn't that big of a transition or a cultural change for us. 1970 was actually the first year that we saw women enrolling in the ROTC programs, both Army and Air Force. And that garnered a lot of news coverage and a lot of talk about the opportunities for women and these issues of equality at the same time that the campus is thinking about throwing the program off campus or removing it from the campus. And in 1974, we had our first woman commissioned out of the program. Pamela Davis was commissioned out of Air Force ROTC. She would go on to spend an entire career in the Air Force and the Air National Guard and retire as a lieutenant colonel. And we also had the opportunity to bring her back to campus this year as our speaker during our Veterans Day ceremony. So she's still, connected to the university and understands her role as being that first woman commissioned out of one of our ROTC programs. Now, I don't want to get into all the history of mascots and everything, but I'm going to touch on it for just a second, because it was also in the 1970s that we really cemented the identity of the ROTC program, the Army ROTC program in particular. And so you can see here the ROTC patch from back in the day. It was during this period that ROTC solicited the Army to officially become the Screaming Bison Battalion, or the Bison Battalion. They went to the Army's Heraldry Division and got official permission to be the Bison Battalion. And there's a multi-page sort of document, and they have to sketch out why they want to do this and what they think the emblem will look like and all that. And so you can see this legacy living on today, not just with ROTC, which is mascot-wise, our Bison has been chosen as the IU mascot on 3 different occasions. And this was one of those periods where it had just sort of faded out in the athletic world, but ROTC kept it going. And so they are one of the legacies of the Bison mascot that you see around campus. The other most prominent one that most people are familiar with is Nick's. So if you've ever been to Nick's bar and restaurant here in town, the Nick's Bison with his IU sweater, that's kind of the other sort of legacy of that time period where we had this Bison as a mascot. So after the 1970s and the gender integration, the ROTC programs really laid pretty low through the late 70s and the 80s. There were people in them. They produced some great leaders. I've interviewed a number of folks that graduated from here in the 70s and 80s and commissioned out of here or were in ROTC when they were here. But they really stayed off the radar for quite a while after that. And it wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s when the issue of homosexuality and sexual orientation came up in the military that this conversation really started again. And the way that this came up, so a little background here, homosexuality was specifically outlawed in the military all the way back to the Revolution. And there was talk about changing that. As part of the effort to get that change made, the Bloomington Faculty Council in 1991 passed a resolution along with IUSA mandating that the ROTC programs, therefore the Army and the Air Force, needed to change its non-discrimination policy or its discriminating policy related to sexual orientation. And they needed to change it by 1995-96, or the university was going to phase out the program by 98-99. So if you know anything else about this period, you'll know that this probably wasn't what triggered what came after this, but pretty quickly some big changes came for the military. So that big change that happened was because IU wasn't the only place that this conversation was happening, and it wasn't just in higher education. all across the country, people were talking about this change, and President Bill Clinton campaigned on getting a change to this policy in the military. He wanted to change the policy to not discriminate based on sexual orientation. He got elected and he tried to make that change, and he wound up with a compromise called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And Don't Ask, Don't Tell was not only not popular here at IU in a lot of ways, it wasn't popular both for those that didn't want to change and those that did, because it was a compromise, and compromise is very rarely popular. But it was an important sort of step in getting those changes made within the military. So I arrived on campus in 2004, and we were still having a lot of conversations about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. By then, 9/11 had happened. We also had the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan that was going on, the global war on terror. So there was a lot of conversations about the military. But what I found was the ROTC programs being kind of small, the veterans population being kind of hidden because they were kind of staying away from this. There was a huge civil military gap in understanding and knowledge of what the military did and didn't do. And some of those sort of challenges that were coming out. And, you know, it set a tone when, you know, recruiters would come to campus, and if they were military recruiters, we would send out messages kind of warning people saying, you know, we know their policies don't align with ours, but we have to let them on campus. And, you know, we weren't really checking the policies of other recruiters that were coming to campus and other corporations, but you know, we were doing that for the military. And that really was one of the primary sources of information that students were getting about the military, was they were hearing this message over and over again, which was really putting some challenges out there for the ROTC program. So in 2011, when Don't Ask, Don't Tell ended, and really before that, because the actual military use of Don't Ask, Don't Tell had dropped so significantly, really that became kind of a non-issue almost by the end of it, because the attitude towards the military on campus had changed quite drastically. But through all of this history, the ROTC programs have continued to flourish on our campus. They are involved and engaged student leaders, whether it is writing for Little Five teams, or it is being involved with research or student government and leadership and other things that are happening around campus. Our ROTC cadets are there, and even if they're not in uniform or they're not wearing, you know, an Air Force or an Army t-shirt all the time, you might not notice them because they just kind of look like the rest of our students. So when I talk to faculty and staff, and sometimes even alumni, about our ROTC programs, or I mention our ROTC programs, they're always surprised to find out that we have some of the top programs in the country, that we produce very desirable young officers with very desirable skills. You know, one of our strengths is our foreign language programs and the work that they do there. We also produce strong leaders in other areas, from business to history to the sciences. We have lots of folks that we're producing as officers into the military through these ROTC programs. And we have a long history of that. There's over 70, I think I'm up to about 75 generals and admirals I know of now that have IU connections. Some were students, some were faculty, some were ROTC cadre, but there are over 70 of them. Of those, about half of them are still living, and out of that half that's still living, a lot of them were connected to the ROTC programs. They were students in it, or they were cadre members who then took classes while they were here, so on and so forth. And so this is a small piece of our campus history. In that sense, nowadays they're small programs, but they had such a big impact on our campus history over the last 200 years. Really wanted to make sure the military science history became a piece of this, and a piece of our program that we're doing this year for the bicentennial with these videos. Speaking of videos, thanks for watching. Thanks for watching the third part of our three-part series on the history of ROTC and military science on campus. Be sure to subscribe. I'm going to put a subscribe button on here somewhere, wherever that shows up at. It'll be the round one. And then I'm going to put a link to part 2, just in case you missed part 2. If you want to go back and check it out, you can. Subscribe to our channel, check out all of our bicentennial videos that we're putting out this year as part of the military history of IU for the bicentennial. Thanks for watching.